Hi, I'm Josh Honeycutt, and today we're talking about how to read deer tracks. Now, there is a lot of material out there that says, yes, you can always tell the difference between a buck and a doe, and yes, you can always tell how big a deer is based on its tracks. And the answer to that is sometimes yes, sometimes no. First, let's talk about the differences between a buck and a doe. On a doe, the front tracks are going to be closer together than the rear tracks. That's because they have a narrower front end and a wider back end. It's exactly the opposite on a buck. With a buck, the front tracks are going to be wider than the back tracks. They've got a wider shoulder area and a narrower rump. When it comes to the actual size of a track, it can be very different from deer to deer. It's much like an antler's rack. I have seen very mature bucks with small tracks, and I've seen very immature bucks with big tracks. So it's not a surefire thing when you see a track how big a deer is. What you have to pay attention to is how wide those tracks are. Not the actual track, but how far apart they are. If you have tracks that are 1.5 feet apart, you know you're onto a pretty good deer. It's also not uncommon for really old does to have the same size or close to the same size tracks as younger bucks that are, say, 1.5 years, 2.5, and maybe even some 3.5-year-old bucks. There's another aspect of tracks you need to look at, which is the dew claw. Now, there are two things that can make those two small marks behind that track, also known as the dew claws, hit the ground. So the first is weight. A really heavy deer is more likely to insert those dew claws into the ground than a lightweight deer. Oftentimes lightweight deer never insert those dew claws into the ground. Now, the other time is when a deer is running, and this is more common. You also have to look at soil conditions. Soil can make a big deer look like a small deer, and a small deer look like a big deer, conditions depending. Also with soil conditions, make sure you pay attention to how old that track is. Fresh track is going to be wetter, it's going to be more defined. An older track is going to be dried, it's going to be less defined. But all things considered, if you find a track that's 3 or 4 fingers wide, and they're anywhere from 1 foot and 2 or 3 inches to 1 foot and 6 or 7 inches apart, you know you're on to a good sized deer. And once you know that deer is there, move in, do some scouting, figure out where that deer's bed is, figure out where its feeding destination is, figure what trails connect the two, set up an ambush, and get ready to fill that tag.